Hello, everybody who's just joining us. We're with the People's Forum webinar series, The People's Response to the Crisis. This will be streaming live on the People's Forum YouTube channel, and we are going to begin in just 1 minute. We will begin today's discussion with leaders from the South Africa Shack Dwellers Movement and the National Union of the Homeless. So we'll just begin in 1 minute. Welcome, everybody. My name is Shali Gupta-Barnes. I'm with the Popular Education Project, the Cairo Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice, and the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. We're here today with the People's Forum in its webinar series, The People's Response to the Crisis. In this webinar series, the People's Forum is convening a recurring online space to hear current reports from leaders of people's movements and organizations in the US and across the world. This webinar will be streaming live on the People's Forum YouTube channel, and it will also be recorded. So if you can't join us today, then please watch this. You can find the recording there. Today we have leaders from two global movements of the poor and houseless, Abahlali Basemjondolo, the Shack Dwellers movement from South Africa, and the National Union of the Homeless from the United States. Leaders from these movements of the poor are with us to speak to us about how they are responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, what this pandemic has revealed of the deeper and longer lasting injustices that have brought us to this point, and what we can and must do in this moment to secure a better future for us all. Both of these movements have been on the front lines of the struggle for housing and human rights for years, and their members have a deep militant commitment to each other, to the long struggle for freedom and liberation from capitalism and imperialism, and from systems of violence, oppression, exploitation, and exclusion that manifest most clearly and painfully in the struggles of the homeless. From Abahlali Basemjondolo, we have Sabu Zakode, the former and founding president of Abahlali, which has upwards of 70,000 members across South Africa. And from the National Union of the Homeless, we have Anthony Prince from California, the lead organizer and general counsel for the National Union of the Homeless, and Savina Martin from Massachusetts, who is a senior advisor and member of the Executive Council. The National Union of the Homeless was reconstituted in 2018 and has since expanded to at least 10 states across the United States, with dozens of locals representing thousands of homeless people and the housing insecure. Official numbers in the US measure the homeless population at 500,000 who are homeless any given night, but our estimates place the real number closer to 8 to 11 million. And this too is likely an underestimate of the true nature of housing precarity in this country. So I thought we should begin today by hearing what conditions you all are facing and your members are facing as this pandemic sweeps through our communities. And I wanted to begin with Sabu. We all know that the COVID-19 pandemic is magnifying deeper injustices and repression that have been ongoing for decades against Abahlali and the Shack Dwellers. Can you share some more about the conditions that you are facing with this pandemic, with the national lockdown, the continuing evictions and enduring conditions of not having secure and safe housing?
Thank you very much, Shirley. Just want to greet my comrades there, Anthony and Savina. It is always a pleasure to be invited to the People's Forum, to be sharing our experiences, but also learn from the comrades there. Shirley, I want to, first of all, extend Abahlali's profound solidarity with the struggling organizations there in the United States, but with the entire nation of the United States of America during this difficult period of the pandemic that we are all facing. Reading from the statistics, it is unimaginable how you guys are holding up there. We just want to say from the bottom of our hearts that we are with you. We wish that you can stay strong because we believe it is time for unity, it is time for solidarity, and know that you are never alone in this crucial time. Back to your question, Shelley, it is a very difficult moment in the history of South Africa and in the history of our constituencies, the shack dwellers movement. We must say that South Africa is on the national lockdown, meaning we are all forced to stay at home. We are all confined in our own dark corners of our society with little or no movement at all. This has created a lot of anxiety, distressfulness, and all kinds of confusion that one may think. Now, when this lockdown was announced, when the president of the country in South Africa announced, declared South Africa as a state of disaster, announcing the national lockdown, and the government has actually given a directive that people must stay at home. And then they have also indicated that it is time that we promote hygiene, that people must be washing their hands now and again, and that we must maintain social distance. Now, some of these precautionary measures to combat or cap the spread of coronavirus has made no sense to the homeless and the landless people. For instance, the government assumed that everyone has a house, assume that everyone has clean running water. Now, when shack dwellers are expected to wash their hands minutes after minutes, it becomes a joke because a lot of communities that we are working in do not have water, do not have sanitation. There's hardly any road access, no refuse collection, there's no electricity. All the basic services that we've been fighting for the past 15 years has not been provided. Now, when the government, put out this state of disaster, demands that we ought to be washing our hands, when in fact, we do not have taps. And there is an assumption that everyone has a house, decent house. Now, when the government calls for a social distancing, again, it becomes impossible for the slum dwellers, people who are already overcrowding, to be keeping social distance. So these are difficult moments that our constituencies can adhere to. Given the conditions in which we are living to, it is impossible that we can maintain social distance. It is impossible that we can be washing our hands now and again. Hence, our struggle has always been about the provision of these basic services such as water and sanitation. Now, this call does not therefore apply to the people who are living in shacks. Hence, we have had no choice as Abahlali to continue organizing under those stressful conditions, to continue insist that we are also human beings and ought to be treated with respect and dignity. So Abahlali is still calling for the provision of basic services so that we can also comply with the national directives. We want to comply with the government call because we think it is important that everyone is safe. However, these precautionary measures do not always apply to the informal settlements. Now that many of these shack dwellers are unemployed, having to live at home or for a month without opportunities to find survival means, because some people are self-employed. There's a lot of street vendors, people who sell on the street for their survival. Now that they are locked down at home, people are beginning to face hunger and starvation. Now it's Corona on the one hand, people are also fear and are beginning to worry about food insecurity at the same time. But also thirdly, poor communities are now facing constant violence and illegal evictions that continue to terrorize our communities. Can you imagine the moment in which we are, when we are facing the mysterious monster of the pandemic on the one hand, and the hunger on the other hand, the state violence on the one hand, because the government has used this opportunity again to actually execute their long-planned evictions to our communities. They are using army as well to terrorize our communities. So I'm going to be sharing more about evictions in our next question, but just to say how difficult this moment is for the slum dwellers. It is difficult for a rich man. It is difficult for a middle-class man. Imagine how the impoverished, landless, and homeless person has to survive under these circumstances. However, as a movement, we have not lost hope. We continue to organize. Our hearts, our souls are out there with our communities. We have not been used to this technology of communication, but for a first step, what we have done has been to encourage and direct all our leadership structures at the national, provincial, and branch level to actually set up the WhatsApp group. Imagine also that not every shack dweller has access to internet, and not everyone has a smartphone. But we have used this moment to encourage our leaders and organizers to actually create much more effective system of communication. So we've got our communication up to scratch now. We are able to meet over WhatsApp and Zooms for those who are able to have access to emails. And we are able to communicate with our communities. And we continue to resist eviction because we cannot allow the state to instruct us to obey the national regulation of the disaster management, and while the state organs such as the municipalities continue to terrorize our communities. This is the position in which we stand. We want to respect and comply with the national calls and the precautionary measures of the COVID-19. We want to do that because we think it's important not only to impress the government or anyone. We have a responsibility and a duty, which is the duty to God and duty to our country, duty to our world, to make sure that everyone counts, everyone is safe at this point in time. Hence, we are playing a very major role in communicating with our communities, in giving them hope that this challenge has come, but it will also pass.
Thank you. Thank you, Sabu. I wanted to ask if you could speak a little bit more about the evictions and the escalation of tactics that you're seeing from the state and from the police. Police have been using, we could see from the demands that Abahlali has made around COVID, they're using live ammunition, they're burning buildings, and recently 29 women were arrested for violating the shelter-in-place order because, like you're saying, there is no shelter for them to be sheltered in place. Why, in this moment of even greater vulnerability, why has there been this escalation of violence? And can you just speak a little bit more to that?
Well, the question of state violence is very disturbing. It is disappointing. No government in their right minds will evict people in this point in time. We should all be caring. We should all be worried about the future of our country and the entire world. However, the government, the city governments, particularly in Cape Town and Durban and Johannesburg, continue to use violence on homeless people and landless people. We continue to face violent evictions that are often unlawful in the sense that they are carried without a court order. There is no court of law that has granted these city governments to continue evicting people. It is disappointing in a sense that the Minister of Justice and Correctional Services have issued a directive that evictions must stop. There is a moratorium to all evictions in this country by the Minister of Justice and Correctional Services, but also the Minister of Human Settlement, Water and Sanitation has also directed all city governments to stop evicting people at this time. Not only the national government, but also the UN Special Reportee on the situation of housing has also made a worldwide ban on eviction in these pandemic moments. However, our city governments, especially the eThekwini and Durban and Cape Town, continue to send armed forces escorted by the army in these trying times to evict people. Now imagine the very same disparate people who are facing huge pressure in terms of hunger and starvation, threats of the pandemic, have also had to endure the threats of evictions. Now, on the first day of the national lockdown, on the 26th of March, the city government of Cape Town and Durban have declared war on poor. Several evictions have been taking place day by day. Now, these evictions are very notorious in the sense that they do not just evict people. They confiscate their material, their belongings, including building materials. They also burn down the belongings of the people. These armed forces also steal from the communities. Now, they would arrest and torture people and claim that people have contravened the lockdown, the national lockdown regulations, when it is not the case. Now, 23 women of Abahlali who had nowhere else to go after their homes have been destroyed, they had to lay down on the ground where their homes were. Now, they were arrested just on this Saturday. On Friday, they were arrested just for sitting at home and doing nothing. The women are complying. They've kept their social distance. They're also making sure that they are not in any ways contravening any of these regulations. But the Calvin Security and Family Company, accompanied by the South African Police Services, have just arrested these women of Azania in Katomena. When they were arrested, they were told that they were arrested for contravening the regulations of the lockdown. They were told that they contravened the national directives, or rather the precautions that the government have put in place. But when they got into the police station in custody, they are no longer charged for that particular crime. The crime has been changed now. We are told that they will be charged for trespassing. Now, how can one be trespassing when one has been living in that settlement for the past 12 months? These women have been living there. When their homes were destroyed, they had nowhere else to go. Now they were arrested for being homeless. See how poverty can be criminalized, how homelessness and landlessness becomes a crime. Now, when we sent our legal team, the police failed to find appropriate charge on these women. They were forced to sign a letter, a warning letter that says they will not go back to the land on which they occupy. The women were courageous enough to say, we are not going to go anywhere. It's either you arrest us, charge us, because when you release us, we are going back to the very same land because we have nowhere else to go. Now, again, this tells you a story about the power of women, the courage that they have in making sure that they build the homes of their children, but also for the future generation. They have offered to be arrested instead of lying to the police and say, we won't be going back to the occupation. So again, the police, because they were just terrorizing these women, they still couldn't charge them. They were forced to release them as late as 9:15 at night. 9:15, they were actually discharged without any charge. So this was another victory for women who were not scared, to stand before the police and say, well, instead of us lying to you and compromising the future of our children, you better arrest us because we have nowhere else to go. And those powerful words really forced the police to release them because there was no crime committed. We see a place as we speak. Now, imagine the impoverished people having to face these challenges at a very crucial time in our history when everyone is asked to sit at home in order to cap the spread of coronavirus. We are saying to our comrades across the globe, it is not time for violence. It is not time for division. It is not time to criminalize activists and social justice activists. But it is high time that we maintain unity in order to make sure that everyone is safe, we save our world, we save our planet, we save our families, communities, and our organization. We are calling upon the government to actually deliver to the demands of the people, legitimate basic demands. We are calling for the urgent provision of water and sanitation in the informal settlements. We are calling for a moratorium to all evictions and foreclosure at this point in time. We are calling for the minimum wage to be provided for those who have lost income during this lockdown. But we also stand in solidarity with every healthcare worker, be it the doctors, nurses, the cleaners in our hospital across the globe. These are unsung heroes that are in the forefront of this pandemic, and we need to be supporting them. We need to be saluting their efforts in saving our world, in saving our planets.
Thank you, Sabu. Anthony, Sabina, I know all of this is very familiar to what members of the homeless union here are facing as well, both on the sides of deprivations, not having housing, not having water, not having, any of the requirements necessary to stay clear of this virus. But then also we're hearing of continuing sweeps on encampments, closures, and the ongoing criminalization, which basically, as Sabu is describing, the state-sanctioned organized response against the homeless. Savina, I wondered if you might tell us more about the mission of the National Union of the Homeless and some of its history. And then Anthony, maybe you could tell us more about what's happening in the US and the work that you all are doing right now.
It's perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much, Shali, and thank you, Sabu. Yes, we're neighbors. So thank you again, and on behalf of the houseless here in the US, we would like to thank our sisters and brothers across the globe and the popular education team at the People's Forum for inviting us to shed light on the struggle against imperialism here in the United States. To my colleagues in the struggle again of Sabu and Anthony, it's a pleasure to share and represent this urgent fight in the people's response to the crisis. I'm going to open up with a description of experiences from the National Union of the Homeless, USA, back some 34 years ago. So let's make these connections. The events today reveal the deep and now compounded inequities then and now by this pandemic. Our houseless brothers and sisters are taking up the struggle to organize against a system that refuses to provide the basic necessities to live in one of the most richest countries in the world. This is benign neglect of the capitalist system's refusal to provide for the common defense and promote the general welfare of its most poor. In Section 2 of the National Union of the Homeless's mission statement, it states to tirelessly for the future human right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, for the social and economic justice for all. So our struggle is a global struggle of human rights against a state apparatus' continued attempt to exploit the most poor and vulnerable sections of this population and of society for its own benefit. 34 years ago, the emerging and organized National Union of the Homeless entered the national discourse and disrupted business as usual. The states were hit hard by us and were locked out and were shocked at our ability to organize. We proved that we were homeless, but not helpless. We were former and current homeless men, women, and families made up of displaced workers, students, labor organizers, and allies who were clear, committed, and convinced that we had a choice, and that was to live up to our many slogans. You only get what you are organized to take. So we coordinated simultaneous mass actions, mass housing takeovers in over 17 cities across the US. At that time, it was from California to Philadelphia, Mississippi. We tore the boards off and occupied the houses. Some of our members were thrown out, kicked by the police, like Wilhelmina from Boston. Children were taken into custody in our Minneapolis Union, and we were arrested, jailed, and held for hours. We took over shelters in Boston, and like myself and other women, we refurbished an abandoned building to house women recovering from drugs while waiting for their children to return from foster care. We built encampments and occupied them like the ones in Tompkins Square Park, led by the late Ron Casanova, that was ripped apart violently by the New York City police. In other words, or in the words of the late, great Frederick Douglass, in a hard and riveting speech in 1857, he said, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress, and power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will." So we demanded, Blacks demanded, whites demanded, Indigenous demanded, Latinx and Mexican, we demanded. Over time, we saw our rise as well as our demise. Today, we draw on those very lessons of our past in the 1980s, as well as the early 1990s. We witnessed and planned and what we call the deliberate attempt to dump drugs in our base camps. We saw our leaders fall and succumb to the crack and cocaine epidemic. And the sad HIV and AIDS health crisis and complications of related virus symptoms was a death sentence to the poor. Around the edges of this country, just recently, is about 8 states around the perimeter of the country, some. The numbers of homeless people, according, and we know they're higher, to a 2018 statistics from the National Alliance to End Homelessness, adds up to about 250,000 that are homeless. But we know those numbers go much higher. We are clear in our commitment to unite the poor, and we know that we have a right not to be poor in the midst of all of the US abundance, but we are. We, the National Union of the Homeless, call out the US for forcibly evicting people from their homes, their neighborhoods and communities to build luxury condominiums and dormitories in which students and residents cannot afford. We have a right to adequate housing and clean water to bathe, drink, and cook in. The houseless have a right to health and access to health care rather than sleeping overnight in emergency room hospitals across the US. We have a right to live. We have a right to sleep and rest and not fear that we will receive a citation that we cannot afford to pay and be further beat into a hole of debtor's prison. We have a right not to be demonized, but to provide adequate housing and wages to afford rents. I remember back then as a homeless, young, scared veteran with a small child that was born homeless. We went straight into a battered shelter. My life was spared when I joined the National Union of the Homeless and when I entered into political education classes, how valuable and sustaining it was for me to understand objectively what my rights, fight, and insight stood for. State power here has fear of losing its power. They're greedy and therefore pay themselves to further enrich rather than to provide for the least of these. This is why the call from so many states prompted the need to reestablish the National Union of the Homeless in 2018. We also continue to have deep ties with the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, a vision of our late civil and human rights leader, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., USA. Right now, we are competing with a more deadlier force, the pandemic. So thank you all again, and I will turn over the next section Thank you again, Sabu. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabina.
Thank you, Sabina.
Anthony, did you want to tell us what's happening today, what members of the Homeless Union are facing today, and what it means?
Well, yes, Shalley's. But first of all, I just want to again thank everyone for who's listening and participating in the webinar. Thank People's Forum, yourself, Shalley, and particularly, I have to say that I'm humbled and honored to share this presentation, this program with Sabina Martin. I've known Sabina for many, many years. Sabina and I both go back to the original National Union of the Homeless, as she described. Sabu, I have not met before until this electronic meeting today, but we have learned so much from the shack dwellers movement, from the Abahlali movement. And I will tell you, particularly going back, the early lessons, the formation of the birth and origins of the shack dwellers movement are particularly relevant at this time for our national union, our re-established National Union of the Homeless. I can't tell you, I've been reviewing, of course, Dear Mandela, watched it again for, I don't know, the umpteenth time, and going over and trying to familiarize myself a little bit more with the philosophy and experience and political history of Abahlali. And the lessons that can be drawn are just numerous. And we're going to incorporate those lessons into our national training. We have an officers training school that we have for the National Union of the Homeless, because we can't just fight, we have to have a strategy. We have to know what we're fighting for, what we're up against, and what kind of future we're trying to create in the midst of this battle. So it's really an honor to be a part of this program. Let me just show you something, just give an idea of where we're at. People can see this headline, the Sacramento Bee newspaper of March 20th, just a little less than 3 weeks ago. Stay at home. Except in the city of Sacramento, there's 11,000 homeless people on the streets. In a city where the mayor, Darrell Steinberg, happens to be the chair of the California State Commission on Homelessness and so-called supportive housing. Where the governor, Gavin Newsom, has allocated $177 million supposedly to house homeless people in hotel rooms. And yet only a pittance of that money has actually been spent. That the headlines are full of reports, false reports, that homeless people are being relocated into these hotel rooms. And yet the reality is that our people are still on the streets. But what we're doing, and to address some of the specifics of where we find ourselves as a national union, what we're doing now is we're moving into the camps, into the shelters where we've always been, but we're fortifying these camps. We're bringing direct support to the men, women, and children that are in the camps, on the streets, by the railroad tracks, under the freeway overpasses, in the emergency rooms, and in the shelters, bringing direct support as best we can in terms of washing stations, water, food. All of the limitations that Sabu indicated are now in place, that were already in place as regards homeless people, are exacerbated and made even more difficult to obtain. Food, all of the restaurants and fast food outlets are closed. So places where homeless people could get maybe a hamburger or some French fries, that's not possible. And rather than supply food to people who now have no means to obtain that food, and were at odds to even get that food before the virus, they are actually destroying food. There's a report in this morning's New York Times that millions of pounds of vegetables and fruits, potatoes, and millions of gallons of milk are being destroyed and dumped. And they say it's because, well, we can't supply the markets. But the fact of the matter is that the Walmarts and the Targets and the grocery stores don't have these products. And we know that it's just the capitalist system, once again, to guarantee, to boost up the prices, to guarantee that the economy is given priority over the well-being of human beings. So what we're doing is providing as best we can these kind of direct survival programs. We're doing what historically poor people have done, whether it was in the period of the Underground Railroad, where people ran the fugitive slave, and they created whole communities and whole networks to feed, clothe, protect, defend, hide, survive those who were fleeing their oppression, right up to Hurricane Katrina, where, as you guys know, the primary first responders were the poor and the flood victims themselves. Self-organization and self-rescue. That's what the National Union of the Homeless is doing. And by doing it, we lay bare the complete failure of the system, as Savina said, with all of its resources to provide even the minimum. Just to give you an example of what we're talking about, in Santa Cruz, California, Food Not Bombs, perhaps you guys are familiar with Food Not Bombs. They've been around for 40 years, feeding poor and homeless people for 4 decades. And they're part of our homeless union. And they're being persecuted in the city of Santa Cruz. The Santa Cruz Police Department is trying to shut down our feeding operation. The city of Santa Cruz went to the hotels where we had placed 181 people. The homeless union, Santa Cruz Homeless Union, had managed to place 181 people in 6 hotel rooms in the city of Santa Cruz. What was the response? The police came to those hotels and pressured the hotel owners to evict the homeless, to evict people that we had housed. The homeless union in Santa Cruz was able to find housing, hotel rooms, when the city of Santa Cruz failed to provide a single hotel room for a single homeless person in a population which by definition is at high risk for contracting a deadly virus. What a disgrace. But I will tell you that what we're doing in the course of providing the washing stations, providing the hygiene materials, our union members and officers are at risk of their own lives, moving into these situations, filling that vacuum created by the failures of this system, and they're drawing public support. Just to give you another example, in Rochester, New York, just about 2 weeks ago, 2.5 weeks ago, our Rochester Homeless Union was able to force the city of Rochester to open and pay for 3 floors of the downtown Radisson Hotel, and to take one of the shelters and take those who had been in that shelter where they could not engage in social distancing, where they could not have the kind of protections they need for themselves and for the public, and force the city to move them into the Radisson Hotel. And then the city wanted to appoint representatives of what we call the homeless industrial complex. You guys know what I'm talking about. You know, the NGO and the nonprofit grant recipient tied to the government, apologist, what we used to call poverty pimp sector of the control mechanism in this country. They wanted that group to run the 3 floors. They wanted that group to police and supervise and control the dozens of homeless people that we got into that hotel. And we said no. And under the leadership of president of the local there, Patrick Braswell, and our Rochester Union, with support from some of the clergy, we were able to control that situation. We have union officers empowering the people that are in that hotel now. So the only place that we're aware of where people have been successfully placed into a hotel and taken into a place where they can get some access to medical care and food and clean water and some degree of dignity is where the union has either forced the city to allocate those rooms or we were able to secure them ourselves. So our perspective as a national union is about power. What we're trying to show here is that, like Savina said, we're homeless, not helpless. We are perfectly capable of self-organizing. We're perfectly capable of doing things that the system with all its resources refuses to do. In Sacramento, we have constructed an army, a volunteer army of over 200 people in the city of Sacramento to try and address the issues in the amongst the 11,000 homeless on the streets, including 50 medical students, doctors, and public health nurses from the University of California, Davis, from UC Davis. So what we've done there, by bringing the community into the process, by laying bare the failures of the status quo to remedy the situation, is we built a fortress of social support for the union. We didn't ask the city to do anything. We didn't turn to the community and say, help us. We began self-organizing and empowering our own homeless union officers, members, and those who the union represents. And because we've been able to do that, we've been able to push back to some extent the city of Sacramento and the state government of California, which is finally having to recognize what our efforts, finally recognizing what we're doing out there in the streets. You know, I just want to maybe say one other thing in terms of the union's response to the coronavirus crisis. And that is, from our standpoint, when this pandemic finally abates, the existing pandemic will still be with us. You know what I'm trying to say? It's been shown, the very famous, but unfortunately not very well publicized study by the Columbia School of Public Health, Columbia University, that somewhere in the neighborhood of 200,000 people a year die of poverty. They die of causes directly related to their status as being impoverished in the United States. Well, that's a pandemic. That's a chronic pandemic that we live with every single day. But there's no turning back. Like I think Sabu said, and Sabina also, this pandemic has just kind of accelerated and underscored in stark relief the already existing inequities. And those inequities will stay with us. But in the course of this pandemic, we're learning to build the kind of power, and we're saying we're not going back. They keep talking about we need to return to normal. We don't want to return to normal. We want to go forward into a society and into an arrangement where no one has to go without these basic necessities. So what we're doing is difficult work. What we're doing is risky. And what we're doing is in the face of police repression, evictions. Our people are being threatened with arrest and arrested. Our people are being shot at. Our people are having paintballs. Our people are having attacks. We have people living in tents that have been set on fire. We have social media solicitations for burning down homeless encampments. This is a very serious and dangerous situation that we're facing, but I'm very proud of our union members all across the country for stepping up and making a real difference.
Thank you, Anthony. As you've said, you know, as this pandemic is unfolding, it's becoming very clear that the only response that the powers that be, that the established system can kind of offer in this moment are to evict the homeless, they're to criminalize the poor, and to, you know, make the wealthy more wealthy. There's nothing in their response that actually meets the needs of this pandemic, or as you referenced, the kind of longer pandemic that brought us to this condition. It's also becoming clear that the struggles of the homeless are the leading edge of the broader struggles of the class, the global class of the poor and dispossessed, who struggle with housing, who struggle with water, who struggle with healthcare and jobs and schools and education for our children. And what's being revealed is how many people are vulnerable to not being able to meet those basic needs. Both of the organizations on this call, both of the movements on this call today, have built up this committed, conscious, creative, and brilliant leadership among the ranks of the poor, among the ranks of the homeless and dispossessed. And I just want to spend a few minutes talking about the necessity of that leadership. Sabu, you've often described this leadership as revealing and being entrenched in the living politics, a living politics that is different from the politics of, you know, the status quo. And I wonder if you could just share a little bit about why is the leadership of Abahlali and the National Union of the Homeless and of the poor so important today? And what does it bring to this political moment? What kind of clarity does it bring to us right now? Let's see, Sabu, is your mic working? Can you hear? Okay. Would you, yeah. Sorry, you may not be able to hear me. I think the question, so just to reiterate the question, just why is the living politics that Abahlali and your members represent today, why is that so critical for the broader class struggle that's being revealed in this crisis right now?
Yes, thank you for that. I'm sorry, the internet connection is unstable a bit. But yes, the living politic is key for Abahlali, is the foundation of our movement, because it talks about who we are. It makes a very clear distinction between what we are up against and of course the vision for the organization. So in this crucial time, it calls upon for everyone to contribute in humanizing the world. Now, for the living politics to be key at this point in time, is that it describes the value of our humanity. It talks about the spirit of Ubuntu, the spirit of humanity, the importance of the definition of a person in relation to others. It says that we can only conquer whatever challenges we face, including the pandemic that we face today. It can only be defeated when we are together, when we are united, when we are able to treat one another as human beings that ought to be respected. So it is our foundation of our organization, because without the living politics, all other struggles that we are waging cannot succeed. So it's really about who we are in order to acquire the power that we need in order to defeat the forces that we are up against. So we think it is really a crucial moment for every human life to be valued at this point in time. And it's what we've been calling for, that everyone matters, that everyone is important, that everyone ought to be treated with respect and dignity, and therefore putting human life ahead of profit is paramount important.
Thank you. Yes. Anthony, could you add to that, maybe talking about how that plays out in the leadership that the National Union of the Homeless is offering to the broader class struggles of the poor?
Well, I'll say, excuse me, I'm struggling with this thing. Well, first of all, we want to make clear that the homeless in the United States, that's not a term we even came up with. I mean, the term homeless was really a term that was created by the media and by the powers that be to describe a phenomenon that began to happen in the late 70s and through the mid 80s, and then intensified in the late 80s and early 90s. And the cumulative impact of deindustrialization that created a large mass of people who had been stably employed at one time, and then all of a sudden found themselves out of work. Deindustrialization, the application of technology, capital moving to where it could make the maximum return on its investment. For example, my family on my mother's side, 5 generations in South Chicago, my family, and my people living in South Chicago working for US Steel in the mills. And if you, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, you had from Chicago, Illinois, around the southern end of Lake Michigan up to Gary, Indiana, East Chicago, Hammond, Indiana, 50,000 people working in the steel industry, 50,000 people. Today, you have in that same geographic region, maybe about 8,000 people working in the mills, making more steel than 50,000 made 30 years ago. What happened to those people? Those people became homeless. Those people lost everything that they had. And we want to make the point, and we underscore the point, that the homeless is a section of the working class. That who are the homeless? The homeless are people who have lost what they had because they were no longer able to pay for it, because they lost their jobs, because they were deindustrialized. The mythology that the homeless is some kind of criminal class, some kind of ne'er-do-well class, that the homeless are people that simply don't fit in, fell through the cracks, suffering homelessness as if it was some kind of disease instead of a manifestation of a failed system. This is the kind of portrayal that we wrestle with all the time. So your question, Shally, as to what is the role of the National Union of the Homeless with regard to the whole of the working class movement, is that we're an integral part of it. The statistics show in all of our camps where the union has control, or what we call a union sanctioned camp, 85% of those in those camps lost their jobs in the preceding 6 months. They're workers. People in our camps, for example, in Salinas, right around the corner from the encampment, a day labor place. In Sacramento, 75% of all those who became homeless in the city of Sacramento, born, raised, worked, and paid taxes in the city of Sacramento for 25, 30 years before they became homeless. You know what I'm trying to say? We're talking about a section of the population that has become dispossessed. So that's the first point that has to be made, is that we are part of the working class. So our union, and we think it's a correct form of organization. We call ourselves union because that's a traditional form of organizing different sections of the working class throughout history. And so we see ourselves as part of this broader struggle. And in fact, some of our homeless union officers are card-carrying members of the existing traditional trade unions. The guy who's the president of our Chico union, he's a card-carrying member of the Carpenters Local. The guy who is the first started the Oakland chapter of the homeless union, he was in the Marine Carpenters Union for 25 years. We have people coming into the ranks of the homeless who are bringing with them the experience of the workplace, of the community, of organizing. You know what I'm trying to say? So we reject across the board this attempt by the ruling class to isolate the homeless, to say, well, that's a separate issue. I'll say this though, 30 years ago, 35 years ago, and Savina, correct me if I'm wrong, it was a little bit easier for the ruling class to isolate the homeless, to say, well, they're just the American millstone. I remember in Chicago, they had a series in the paper, American Millstone. They created this term underclass. This was a different group of people. And of course, it incorporated certain elements of racism as well, to characterize the homeless as being only one thing, being only in one place. And it was still true then that you still had a relatively stable section of the working class such that they could kind of get away with isolating the homeless workers. But today, I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true anymore. And our homeless union is proving it. The composition of our union and the ability of our union to influence not just the homeless, but a broader segment of the community. Working class people being evicted from their homes, being evicted from the hotels where they may be paying by the week or by the month. We are fighting on behalf of the tenants, low-income working class tenants who are getting kicked out. We're fighting on behalf of workers who have lost their jobs in this pandemic, and they're not going to get those jobs back. If you think for 1 minute that a capitalist system is going to say, okay, everybody come on back to work, they are not going to bring back those numbers. They're not going to do it. They're going to find a way to produce more with fewer people because that's the economic dynamic. We take up for all these segments of the poor and dispossessed. So our role, and it's just a small part of a bigger fight, is to organize a certain contingent of the working class, the homeless, that section of the working class. But we're not just talking about make things better for the homeless. We're not just about homeless, because that's what the enemy wants us to do, to isolate ourselves. We're taking up for the mass of the dispossessed, 140 million people in this country at or below the poverty line. The average American with no more than $400 in the bank. You see what I'm saying? And this crisis is proving just how tenuous everybody's existence is in this country, just how broad this economic crisis is. So we're very clear. You read our mission statement, we make it very clear that we're not just talking about making things better. We don't accept the status of people living on the street. Okay, give us a tent, give us a sleeping bag. That's not enough for us. Even our relief efforts now, that's not enough. We're doing this to survive, but to survive for what reason? To survive for what reason? So we can go back to the poverty after this pandemic abates? No. So we can go forward to create something new and a broader working class movement in this country.
Thank you, Anthony. I wanted to continue on that topic, and both of your organizations, your movements have mentioned some of the adaptations you've had to make recently, whether it's applying the WhatsApp groups and making sure that all the members of Abahlali, or as many as possible, can be connected and can communicate differently, or the new relationships that the National Union of the Homeless is building. I think it's important for people who are watching this to hear more about those different tactics, how Abahlali and at the National Youth of the Homeless are ensuring that you emerge stronger out of this crisis. Because if there will be 1 billion unemployed, if there will be trillions of dollars lost in the global economy through this, we know that that means that your organizations will continue to grow. And the isolation, as you're saying, will be more difficult, but the organization will be even more important. And so just wanted to ask if you could share some of the, are there new alliances or relationships that have more potential now than they did before, new openings, and what other kind of adaptations are happening right now that can ensure that your critical organizations or critical movements come out of this crisis stronger, perhaps, than when this started. Sabu, could you start?
Yes, thank you for that. We are very honored to be receiving so much support. There's a pouring support of solidarity from all sectors of our society. I just want to thank the folks out there who have really been part of the journey of Abahlali, which hasn't really been easy for one to associate themselves with the radical but very disciplined and peaceful movement like Abahlali, who have taken direct action without compromising anyone's rights. We are saying it is important for us to extend that gratitude in the time of pandemics such as this. We continue to receive amazing support. We continue to build allies and alliances with different organizations across society who are really wanting to be on the side of Abahlali through a number of interventions in order to be able to support, especially with provision of food, but also there is a window of engaging the state that is also opening at the same time. We may have this difficult relationship with the local government, with the city governments. However, at the national level, I must say that we are beginning to engage on a very serious level where the National Department of Human Settlement, Water and Sanitation, for instance, is able to liaise direct with the leadership of Abahlali in as far as providing water tanks and sanitation in some of the communities that have never seen a water taps in their communities. Now, it's one of the things that the pandemic has exposed, that the state is capable of providing these basic services to millions of South Africa. That has not happened over the past 15 years. We've engaged in this struggle. We are seeing this happening. So we are saying the pandemic has also opened this window of engaging with the state, which has really been impossible, almost impossible all these years. So we want to appreciate that and we want to build on that. So this should not be the temporary because of the pandemic. We want to build this relationship even with the state moving forward. We know that these are not easy, but it's important that the politicians at least leave their politics one side at this time. And so the partners that we are having also are able to give hands to Abahlali so that we are also able to provide sanitizers and product would enable our communities on the ground to stay safe, but also, you know, the distribution of the educational materials such as your pamphlet and booklets that will enlighten our communities around the spread of COVID-19 at this point in time, but also provide them with sanitizers and for needy families, and so that we are also able to provide food. And we want to appreciate these kinds of support that are really pouring. So it has given us some strength to continue the fight that we are continuing, but we still insist that everyone counts, and therefore this time on every sector of our society to, to unite and speak in one voice in combating the spread of corona. But the interesting moment also about the coronavirus crisis is that it has exposed the lies of our democracy that has put the interest of profit ahead of human needs. The coronavirus has also exposed the inequalities that exist in our respective countries that tends to put profit ahead of human needs. However, it has created also a moment of a new start, a new beginning, a moment of unity, a moment of solidarity and humanism. And we are saying we should grab this moment, as hard as it is, to actually build an equal and a just society where every man, woman, and child is treated with respect and our in humanizing the world. And I think this moment calls upon that to put our humanity first ahead of profit. That's what the pandemic has awarded us with an opportunity to say, without our humanity, the profits that the capital has been, pushing all these years have nothing to offer at this point in time. So it is a moment to rethink our politics. It is a time to rethink our economy, our political economy, that would rather put human needs ahead of profit.
Yes, I just wanted to reiterate something that you said about how this pandemic has exposed the lies, whether it's the lies of scarcity, the lies that the state can't provide for these needs, where we can see that the state, our governments can provide for these needs, and in this time they must, and how critical is then to keep pushing, as Anthony was saying earlier, to keep pushing so we don't return to, so we keep advancing the struggle for all of our rights. Savina, Anthony, did you want to say more on this point about adaptations and new relationships that are being, that the possibility of engaging with today is different through this pandemic, and what that offers for the National Union of the Homeless, across the country?
Yeah, if I could add, and thank you, Tony and Sabu and Shali again. So the pandemic has reinforced our commitment to continue to unite and build from the bottom up, and to also unite and build with our alliances, for instance, across the country, like Put People First Pennsylvania, around the struggles of healthcare rights, the Cairo Center, the University of the Poor, the People's Forum, for creating these spaces and standing beside us and merging together in solidarity. We cannot do this without each other, right? And we have to build this on love and in love for one another, regarding our plight, fight, and insight in our struggles, in our global struggles, right? Sabu, your struggle is our struggle. We're here, together to talk about building relationships globally. So yeah, we've been looking at our infrastructure very deeply. We're setting up our media structure in communications by some of our most prolific homeless leaders across the country. For instance, and I know he won't mind me mentioning his name, James Shearer, who has one of the oldest newspapers, Spare Change, run, operated, and founded by and for homeless men and women. And so he's our media director. And our national executive secretary, Kristen Coangelo, whose mom was in the original homeless union. So we've been breaking the isolation. We have a homeless history project that we're working on building and archiving. We have, again, the University of the Poor with instructors that, we know the importance of engaging cadre and building, building this movement, a movement of fighting men and women across this country. So yeah, we've got a lot of work to do, a lot of research to do. It's not business as usual. We don't plan on going back the way it was. We hopefully, with all of us together, we could reimagine the type of society we want as we continue our fight, and engaging in identifying who the real enemy is, right? So yeah.
I wanted to also make sure that we had time. It's important. We are up against an economic system that is global. It's a global capitalist system, and we have to build our global, our proletarian internationalism. That's the response that must come from the struggles of the poor and dispossessed to build our common cause against these forces. And so we've been trying to have this conversation, but if there are questions that you have directly for each other, I mean, this is one of the times to raise them, especially, there will be others, but now on the call, before we open up for any questions from the participants, the attendees, if you all have questions for each other that you wanted to raise, maybe we could do that now.
Well, I have a question for both Savina and Sabu, and that is, and let me frame it by saying, by addressing the last question you put, Shally, which was that adjustments that have to be made. How are we dealing with that? And I want to raise the question of expansion and consolidation, because the conditions are now set, and we're already beginning to see it happen, a rapid expansion of our union in terms of members, locals, interest, credibility, and power. But at the same time, and I'm talking about an expansion of significant quantitative aspect in the thousands and tens of thousands. The army's out there, and they're starting to come to us. But at the same time, how do we keep our direction? How do we make certain that we build this thing moving in a certain direction? Consolidation and expansion. And Sabu, I noticed in just learning a little bit that I need to learn a lot more about the Abahlali movement. It seems like you've been able to do that, to at one and the same time have some kind of process whereby a movement which could be threatened by becoming so big that it loses its way and gets off track, and at the same time avoids just being a small little sect that has all the answers but doesn't have the forces to actually impose its will. And that's a challenge I think we're running into very quickly with the National Union. And if both Sabina and yourself could address that, that would be helpful to us.
Yes, if I may start, Savina, thanks, Anthony, for your question. I must say, this is not an easy question. To build a powerful organization, one needs to be very patient in terms of time. It takes time. One has to take time to consult properly. We got to build a very strong foundation, and we got to be believing from democracy from below. The democracy that allows members in various confined corners to feel part of the organizations. We got to be slow to enable the very same voice that is confined in the dark corners of our society to emerge and support. And sometimes these big questions, we should not be concerned about answering them as leaders, as organizers. Our role is to facilitate and allow the very same masses of people that we want to organize or claim to be organizing to be coming up with a day-to-day program and the future of our organization. So the question of expansion lies on the strong foundation that once built today. And I must say, we should not rush to be suddenly becoming big, because it's easy to collapse if one really wants to be expanding so quickly. my suggestion is that we slowly build the very strong foundation from where we are, starting small, starting from the legal resources that we have within the very neighborhood communities that surrounds us, and then slowly expand. This has not been easy, and especially in this point in time where our movements are also limited. And it's not the culture of Abahlali just to say, to be communicating in this high level of technology. This really poses a threat to the movement. As I was saying earlier on, not everyone has access to internet. Not everyone is privileged to be speaking on webinars and Zooms and you know, all this sort of technology. So, but again, we are making a clarion call to our members. We expect our members to save us. We are not going to save our movement, but our wisdom would be when we are able and provide a platform, or rather a conducive opportunity for our members to be giving directions that we want as an organization. So really, this is not an easy question at this point in time. We are still battling, you know, to find a way out. However, because we've tried it for many years and we have credibility and high respect, you know, by our members, they respect us, they trust us. We are just making calls to say, can members give direction? You know, at a time of crisis like that, we've been through a number of crises internally as an organization to the verge of collapse. However, when organization belongs to its members and not to its leaders, then we are likely to be led to the right direction. So this is, of course, a difficult moment for us as leaders to think that we can be a messiah that comes up with all answers that we are facing. We are going to collapse. Rather, let's provide a conducive platform for members in our constituencies to give direction. So the day-to-day and the future of our organization has to be dictated by the masses that we are building. Ours is to facilitate, allow, never close the space of discussion for a way forward to implement it.
That's very helpful.
Yeah. Thank
Very
you,
helpful.
Sabu. Yeah, this is a very challenging question and take a lot of thought and critical thinking, and also a type of stillness, to your point, Sabu, and hearing what the masses are saying. Lots of fire alarms being rung, right? We're hearing a lot. Also, if we don't, this work is not for the faint at heart, right? It's very tough, it's very challenging, but when it comes to saving your life, you have like no other choice. Political education is extremely important. We know that there's another word that we use, and that's replicate, just like we have to organize. We do have to pass on what it is that we've learned, along with the mistakes, as well as the victories, right? We didn't get here in one day. So remember, sometimes we just have to know when to retreat and when to think, and then go back and facilitate and organize. So thank you for that question, Tony. I can't answer it. I think the shift that we're feeling right now can lend to direction and a way forward, right? And it's also a time to build, to learn more about the networks and technological, the revolution that we're in right now, because this is going to be a struggle. I don't think we're going back to the same way. So that's an opening that we can begin to look at, think about, and analyze. So thank you for that.
So I might I might turn actually to ask you all for closing comments, but there is something counterintuitive. I just wanted to summarize a little bit from what Savina and Sabu were just telling us, that in this moment of an emergency, we need patience. In this moment of crisis, we need to stand still. And that doesn't mean we're not acting. It doesn't mean people aren't thrown into motion, but it means being able to make the space, as you all were saying, for the leadership of the poor to emerge, and offer the direction for the rest of society to follow. And so with that, I wanted to ask if you all have closing comments as we end this discussion, but we know that our struggle will continue and we will be always connected. But for this discussion, do you have closing comments to offer as we end our time today?
Well, if I may start, just want to thank the People's Forum and all its alliance partners for having organized this platform for us to share our experiences in this confused time, but also to give hope to everyone out there, to say, as confused as we are, the very same system and forces that we're up against is also confused and is collapsing. We must never forget that that this is an opportunity, that the system is collapsing itself, the very imperial and capitalist system that has really destroyed our foundation of humanity by imposing, of course, profit over human needs. It is time to rethink our infrastructure for a better future. It is time to put human needs ahead of profit. So my closing really would be to say there is hope even at the end of the tunnel. The fact that we are vulnerable and confused today, it doesn't mean that the system that we are up against is celebrating. It is as confused as we are. So let us not be vulnerable. Let us be calm, patient. It is time for solidarity, unity, and support. And together we shall conquer. You are not alone, and we hope and we gain our strength from your support. We are saying, Amandla, aluta continua.
Thank you, Sabu. Anthony, Savina.
Savina, you go first. Dr. Martin.
Thank you, Sabu. Yeah, I would totally ditto those sentiments in that the closing with the word hope, that we should be hopeful. But at the same time, we are in a fight for our lives as we are witnessing a collapsing of a dying monster that has tried to suck us up in the belly of the beast and has blood on their hands. And that we should muster up all the strength from our former ancestors, leaders and abolitionists have helped us to go back and reflect in the history, knowing that we've come through a lot. We've come through pandemics. We've come through enslaved. We've come through so much. And the violence of the poor is the most, I guess, deepest expression of where we're at now. And it's going to turn on itself. So yeah, continue to hold on to hope, love, and keep up the fight. I guess I want to say we shall not be moved. That's it.
Well, again, just as my colleagues have done, I also want to thank People's Forum and thank all those who participated in today's program. And I would say just a couple of things in closing. That first, I think that this challenge, and I really listened carefully to what Sabu said about having the membership, having a confidence in the ability of the membership of Abahlali to take care of the organization and to see to it that at that level of trust, that's really the success. It has to be an aspect of success, what you have had for all these years. We have the same feeling in the Homeless Union. We invest a great deal of trust in our local leaders. We don't tell them how to do things. We share collectively what to do, and how to do it is something that they figure out with their own native intelligence and their skills and their organic connection to the actual struggle, along with what they've learned in terms of political education. It can't be one thing or the other. You know, we are fighters. We are not sitting around analyzing things for the sake of analysis. We're not taking notes to write a book 5 years from now, though that also is necessary. We're summing up constantly what we see in front of us and drawing from that environment to build a durable movement going forward. And I would think that question of getting that right dialectic, you know, of quantity and quality, of being able to appreciate the inevitability of a broad movement. This is what we're looking at. I'll tell you that when this call began at 12 noon my time out here in California, simultaneously there's and why none of our homeless officers could participate today is because across California, there was a Zoom call of upwards of 500 participants to discuss what's happening with the refusal of the government to actually provide these hotel rooms and what kind of mass coordinated movement can be built to address that issue. But it can't be just a mass movement. It has to be a movement that's durable and goes to the roots of the problem. Otherwise, we can't build anything that will address the pandemic that will still be with us, as we talked about before. You know what I'm trying to say? It can't be just a situational response that's limited by the boundaries of the crisis. It has to be using the crisis as the foundation and the launching pad, you know, to move forward to a new level. So I'll just say this. I try to compare what we're trying to be to the hinge on a door. You know, a door, even a big bank vault door, you know, 4, 5, 6 inch thickness, still turns on small hinges. It turns, and this whole term hinge, it all hinges on this. You know, our success hinges on that. Our fate hinges on, you know, I'm trying to say the word hinge is an important concept. And what is a hinge? A hinge, first of all, has to be positioned in the right place on that door. The hinge itself has to be strong, and the hinge itself has to be firmly attached to the thing on which it's going to make turn. You know what I'm trying to say? So we're small, and even if we grow exponentially, we're still going to be small in relation to the millions of people in this country and in relation to the power, the overwhelming resources that our adversaries have. But if we position ourselves, if we're strong and we're firmly attached, that big door can turn on the hinge that we're building today. And that's how I like to frame our homeless union, so that our leaders understand the position they occupy, and that it's possible, even as we're suffering, really suffering now, and it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking to see it. But out of that heartbreak, if we can stay focused, to position ourselves, to remain strong and firmly attached, and understand the direction we're going in. Because when you put the hinge on the door, you got to make sure the door is turning in the right direction, or you might end up slamming yourself in the face instead of opening an entry point. You know what I'm saying? So if we can do those things, I feel very confident that we're going to move forward. And these kind of discussions, we need to have them in every single format, because at each step of the way, this is a building site. This is a construction site for building something. And we have to learn from the past, and at the same time, be willing to take risks going forward into the future. So for me, it's been a real pleasure to be a part of the program. And thanks again to People's Forum and Shally for pulling it together.
Thank you, everybody. for being on this call today. Once again, this was live streamed on YouTube, and the recording will be made available at the People's Forum channel. And I wanted to return to something that Savina said earlier, that power concedes nothing without a demand. And Abahlali and the National Union of the Homeless are ensuring that we are building the power and we are making the demands that will compel the power structures of the system to say yes when they've been saying no for a very long time. So thank you, everybody, and take good care, and we'll be in touch soon.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sabu. Thank you, Sally and Tony. Power to the people.
Homeless, not helpless. Manava,
Forward together,
not one step back.
not one step back.
Bye, comrades.